now, and I will share my screen.
All right. Well, welcome. Tonight we're going to listen to Liz Schotman talk about the ocean-friendly restaurants program that our Northwest Straits Chapter, the Surfrider Foundation, participates in. We're super excited to have her. She is our new Washington Regional Manager. She started just back in March, but she's been involved with the Olympia chapter since the fall of 2018 as their volunteer coordinator. So we're super happy to have her on board, and maybe someday sooner, hopefully than later, we can actually meet with her in person. But for now, we're meeting by Zoom. She has a background in conservation biology. She's an educator and a GIS professional by training. Self-proclaimed mediocre surfer at best, but I have yet to see her surf, so hopefully I'll get to see her surf sometime and see how true that is. And she is totally obsessed with mola molas. So without further ado, I'll let Liz take it from here and talk about ocean-friendly restaurants. Thanks so much.
That was the best intro. Thank you, Eleanor. All right, so we can't talk about the Ocean Friendly Restaurants program without, hold on. Not letting me advance. There we go. Without talking about plastic pollution. So the first part of this is probably going to be a little bit of preaching to the choir, as I'm sure you're all aware of the issues with plastic pollution. It doesn't really break down. It just breaks apart into smaller and smaller pieces called microplastics, which is anything less than 5 millimeters. So it doesn't truly biodegrade. It just gets smaller. And every piece of plastic that was ever made pretty much still exists somewhere on the earth. And we're finding it in more and more remote places. If you're in tune with environmental research, it seems like every other week there's another paper that's published about finding microplastics in some remote area that we would not normally expect to find plastic. So we found it in remote alpine environments, the Pyrenees Mountains in Spain, which are like over 100 kilometers from the nearest city. They found microplastics at the top of these peaks, which is pretty unexpected and alarming because it means it's being transmitted in our atmosphere, basically. We found them in the deepest parts of our ocean, so the Mariana Trench, which is particularly alarming because we know very little about deep ocean ecosystems. We know more about the moon than we know about our deep ocean, and we are not really going to have a full baseline understanding of these ecosystems prior to when we inundated them with plastic. And we're finding more and more plastics on the seafloor. In fact, many of you have probably heard of the Pacific Garbage Patch and these ocean gyres that collect and aggregate floating plastic, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of that plastic has already sunk to the bottom. It's in our air and the air we breathe. One study found like 4% of our dust particles are plastic. It's in our water. 94% of tap water sampled in certain research projects found microplastics in our water. A lot of those are in the form of microfibers. When we wash our clothes, many of our clothes are made of polyester or other plastic products like our microfleeces, and that water gets into the environment or into our wastewater treatment facilities, which were typically built before this was an issue, and so they're not really equipped to filter those out of our water. And because it's in our water and our oceans, it's also in our seafood. They're finding all sorts of planktivorous animals, so jellyfish and tuna kits and things that are out in the middle of the ocean are filter feeders that usually eat plankton, but now they're starting to eat microplastics that they filter out. And then of course that bioaccumulates up the food chain and ends up in our top predators, which are typically the fish that we like to eat as humans. In our oysters, sorry Michael to ruin your oyster day this weekend, but because they are filter feeders, they are prone to filtering microplastics out of the water. One study in Oregon found an average of 11 pieces of microplastic per oyster and like 9 pieces per clam. And it's in our salt because a lot of our salt is derived from seawater, and one study found 94% of salt products worldwide contained microplastics. And worst of all, it's in our beer because it's also in our water. And they found a study around the Great Lakes that looked at large and small craft breweries, found 100% of their samples they tested had microplastics in it. So this is a ubiquitous form of pollution that we're just now beginning to realize how serious it is. And we don't really fully know the health consequences or the environmental consequences. So plastic sucks. It is a petrochemical product, so it's a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry. And so obviously creating it has serious climate change implications. There are huge human health effects associated with it because it's in the air we breathe and the water we drink and the salt that we eat. It is in our bodies. One German study found, they looked at several thousand children and they found like 97% of them had these chemicals and these molecules derived from plastic in their blood and urine samples in the past decade. And there's all sorts of health effects linked to these. It's still kind of a growing field of research, but we know that it can cause infertility, it can cause cancer, endocrine disruption and childhood development problems, birth defects. If you have pre-existing conditions, it can exacerbate those. A lot of different chemicals go into different kinds of plastics, and so it's hard to pin down, but it's definitely not good for us health-wise. And it's also really bad for wildlife. You've probably seen lots of pictures of wildlife entangled in things like derelict fishing nets, which is another form of plastic pollution. So aside from entanglement, I'm a child of the 90s, so I still can't help but cut my 6-pack rings into little bits to try to avoid them escaping into the environment and potentially entangling any sea creatures. They also eat it. So this is a pretty classic picture, unfortunately, of a baby albatross. So a lot of pelagic seabirds will dive down and scoop water off the surface of the ocean and bring it back and regurgitate that into their offspring. And then not only is plastic toxic because it's made of fossil fuels, it can also absorb ambient toxins in the environment because it's a hydrophobic molecule and it can absorb other hydrophobic, potentially harmful chemicals. So they can actually increase in their toxicity. In addition to being toxic, they also just fill these animals up. And so if you're eating a lot of plastic, you're gonna feel full, but you're not getting any nutrients. And so you could also starve to death. I think roughly 1 million seabirds are killed every year because of plastic ingestion. Half the sea turtles we've measured have ingested them. I used to work at a sea turtle hospital and we found a turtle with over 200 cigarette butts in its stomach. And it's also a vector for disease. And so these floating plastic bits are basically transferring microbes and fungus and viruses around the globe in these ocean and air currents. And so they come into contact with things like corals. I read a study recently that corals normally have like a 4% risk of disease, but if they're exposed, like physically touched by plastic, that disease risk increases to almost 90% because it's just carrying these potential pathogens far and wide in our environment. Some plastics have flame retardants in them, and those flame retardants have been shown to increase salmon's risk to disease. And so it's just endless. And of course, there's an environmental justice and climate change nightmare. For those of you who have seen The Story of Plastic or other plastic-based documentaries, it's becoming increasingly apparent that we're really bad at dealing with our plastic waste in this country. We export a lot of it to other countries that don't often have the infrastructure to handle that waste. And so it gets burned or gets dumped in the ocean, and it becomes a big human rights issue because it just completely wrecks environments far and wide that we export this stuff to. And here in the US, the facilities that process these chemicals and fossil fuels and create plastics, things like incinerators, and ethane cracking facilities, which are a step in creating plastic. These facilities are often located in low-income and minority communities. So it's a big social justice issue, even here in this country. So ultimately, it's a big, ubiquitous, and tricky subject that touches on pretty much every aspect of our globalized world. So looking at the statistics of it, we make about 600 billion pounds of plastic every year. About half of that is single use, which is kind of mind-blowing that half of the plastic we produce is only designed to be used once and thrown away. And a lot of that isn't even used before it gets thrown away. And so that about 16 billion pounds of that enters our oceans. And I think it's about 80% of the plastic that enters our oceans is derived, it starts out as on land. So some stuff is dumped directly into the ocean. Sometimes container ships like lose containers full of plastic, but the majority of plastic that we are finding in our oceans and our waterways is from a terrestrial source that's getting washed into our waters and ultimately to our oceans. And so 16 billion pounds a year is roughly about a dumpster truck every minute. So in the time it takes me to talk to you about this stuff, several dozen dump trucks are pouring plastic into our oceans, which is a pretty depressing statistic. And that is expected to double in the next 10 years. So in 2030, it'll probably be 2 dump trucks a minute, unless we can stop it. And the vast majority of the cleanups that the Ocean Conservancy, which has been doing cleanups for decades, Surfrider has been doing cleanups for a long time as well. And we collect data on when we do those cleanups. We count, we measure, we weigh, we identify. And that data has shown us that time and time again, year after year, foodware is the top 10 to 20 items that we collect on these beach cleanups. Except for cigarette butts, they are consistently #1, the most littered item on Earth, and they're also made of plastic and full of toxic, horrible things. But time and time again, the top 10 and beyond. This infographic is from Ocean Conservancy's 2019 report. And I read the Tides database that they maintain, that they collect all that data from their cleanups. I think it wasn't until number 22 that you found like construction waste or something that was not foodware related. Here at Surfrider, we've also been doing cleanups for decades. We've only recently sort of upgraded our data collection efforts and kind of upgraded our database so that we can collect the valuable information from these cleanups that we can then use to help promote policy change. So these are numbers just from 2020, this year. And you can see like plastic bags and bottles are some of the top items that we find. And so we can take that information to decision makers and policy and be like, we need a bag fee like we passed earlier this year in Washington, because we're consistently seeing these as like one of the top items we're picking up off our shores. And so that's really valuable, powerful information that really helps drive that policy change. So one solution of many that we have to implement is our ocean-friendly restaurants program. And so this is a certification program. So what that means is that restaurants abide by certain criteria, and then they pay an annual fee to Surfrider, which then certifies them as ocean-friendly. And so it's sort of a grassroots business approach, because Surfrider is a grassroots organization. And so it was initially designed to reduce the use of single-use plastics. That's kind of the main goal. But part of the criteria for ocean friendly also involves other sustainable practices like energy efficiency and water conservation and things like that, which I'll talk about in a second, because we do want to promote other sustainable choices that the restaurant industry implements, in addition to the reduction of plastic use. And the cool thing that I like about ocean-friendly restaurants is that it's sort of a cyclical thing. So you have these volunteers that support certifying these restaurants and work with them to get the criteria and get the certification. And then those restaurants in turn can inspire and educate and raise awareness with their customers about what it means to be ocean-friendly, and sort of draw attention to not just the problems of these plastics, but some of the solutions that are out there. So I think that's one of the reasons it's been a very successful program. So it's only been around for a couple years. It started in California in 2013 with the Huntington Beach chapter, and they kind of worked out the kinks and sort of figured it out, I guess, as Surfrider chapters tend to do. And it launched nationally in 2018. So it's only been around for a little over 2 years, and we already have like 660 registered OFRs nationwide. So they're in 12 different states and over 70 different cities. And so it's been it's our newest program, but it's been really successful so far. And I think a lot of that has to do with that cyclical nature of, communities working together with local businesses to like create some change. And while again, it's not like the perfect solution that's going to solve the plastic crisis, it does make a big difference. Like we estimate that our OFRs serve about 160,000 plastic-free meals every day. Which again is a drop in the plastic bucket, but still not insignificant. Like that's a lot of plastic that is not being used and ending up either in a landfill or our oceans. So how do you be ocean friendly? So you have to meet 5 mandatory criteria. So number 1 is no styrofoam. Styrofoam sucks, you can't have it, it can't be recycled, and it's very lightweight. And so it's very likely that it gets blown off of a dump truck or finds its way into our waterways. So I hate styrofoam, and so I love the fact that this is sort of just a blanket criteria. Another one is proper recycling. This will probably have to be sort of addressed in a case-by-case basis. As many of you might be aware, the recycling industry has kind of undergone some changes, and it's kind of broken right now as a system. So we do promote, any sort of recycling where there's waste sorting and reduction of waste. I think would qualify a restaurant for this, but the recycling industry still has a lot of work to do. So hopefully we'll see some updates and clarifications going forward with that one. Reusable foodware for on-site dining is one. So if you sit down, nobody's going to serve you food with plastic silverware on a styrofoam plate when you're just sitting down to eat. And if you're trying to get takeout, they're not going to put all your takeout containers in a plastic bag and throw a bunch of plastic silverware in there unless you request that. It's one of those things that I am really bad at remembering to ask for restaurants not to do when I order takeout. And so I love this particular criteria, because I end up with a plastic glove box full of plastic silverware that just I carry around with me, and my guilt because I forgot once again to ask them to please exclude that from my takeout. And finally, they do provide straws, but they can't be plastic, and they have to be asked for only. So again, no plastic straws is great, but even paper straws have a footprint and require products, and we do want to reduce that waste before we reuse or recycle. And so making those items ask for only is a very simple change that any restaurant can implement that can drastically reduce the amount of anything they use, whether it's a plastic product or a non-plastic product. So in addition to those 5 mandatory criteria, the ocean-friendly restaurants also have to pick at least 2 of these optional criteria. So some opt to not sell anything in plastic bottles. If you remember from the infographics, plastic bottles are one of the top 5 items, top 3 items that we consistently find cleanups around the world. And so some of them just don't sell those products, which is awesome. Some of them will offer discounts for reusable containers. So Starbucks, which is not an ocean-friendly restaurant, or a lot of coffee shops, for example, you bring your mug and you get like a 15-cent discount. So that's great. Right now, that's a little weird because of COVID, and some restaurants are not allowed to have reusables, although that's starting to change back as new research emerges about COVID transmission, but that's one option. I think we recently passed legislation in Washington to help the reusable container, like bringing your own reusable container into a restaurant. Apparently it was not entirely legal to bring a Tupperware and use that to collect your leftovers and bring it out. Not that restaurants would ever argue that, but I think they've updated that legislation recently. You can check in with Zero Waste Washington. They worked on that bill, and they have a lot more information on it, but that's a great step towards allowing reusables in your restaurants. Vegetarian and vegan options offered on a regular basis. I'm sure we've all been in that situation where either you're a vegetarian or your friend is, and the only thing they can eat at a place are French fries. And the agricultural industry is one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. And so we do want to acknowledge and reward restaurants that offer vegetarian and vegan menu choices on a regular basis, because that's a very simple way for a lot of people to drastically reduce their carbon footprint, and that is by eating less meat, particularly red meat and cattle. Also, seafood can be certified sustainable by the Seafood Watch, which is one of the more reputable certification programs out there. So anything labeled as best choice or good alternative seafood, because the fishing industry it's got a lot of work. Fisheries around the world are not doing great. And so focusing on high quality products that are caught in a sustainable manner is really important for the future of our fisheries. And so we want to reward restaurants that offer those choices. And then anybody who implements any sort of water waste reduction, water conservation, energy efficiency efforts, whether that's LED lights and energy efficient appliances, or waste sorting and compost, or anything that reduces waste in their industry is also qualifying. So what do restaurants get out of becoming an OFR? Well, one, they get to tap into the powerful activist network that is Surfrider. We have over 250,000 people engaged in our work nationally. We have 7 international affiliates. And you know, we're pretty good at spreading the message and elevating issues, and we have a pretty recognizable brand. And so restaurants get to tap into that, which can be incredibly beneficial for, you know, advertising and getting their product out there. We add the location of your restaurant and information about it onto our OFR web map, which I'll show you guys in a little bit. But it's accessible through our national web page, OFR page, and you can actually download it to your phone. So that's super awesome, because when I travel, I hate going to a new place and being like, oh, I'm gonna go to this restaurant, and then I get surprised with some styrofoam and a sack full of plastic that I feel shame and guilt about for days afterwards. So I use this a lot when I'm traveling to places unknown, where I'm like, oh, I can find this restaurant and feel assured that I'm not gonna accidentally buy some styrofoam or some plastic, which is great. The chapters do a ton to support these restaurants in various ways. During normal times, we have launch parties, we have events to celebrate new LFRs or renewals. We host our regular, like our monthly chapter meetings, and usually EC meetings are often held at OFRs, so they get a lot of business at least once or twice a month from the Surfrider community. We also do a lot of advertising and promoting on social media, and just try to get the word out and really elevate what these businesses are doing to protect our oceans. They also get access to a preferred vendor program. And so a lot of non-plastic alternatives are expensive, unfortunately. That's why plastic is a ubiquitous issue, is because it is so cheap. And so we want to try to connect restaurants to vendors and companies that are selling non-plastic alternatives to things like takeout containers and such, and allow them a discount to help mitigate the potential financial burden of opting out of plastic, because styrofoam and plastic are still, unfortunately right now, usually way cheaper than most other alternatives. And then we also have staff scientists and people like paid staff working to create reports, blog posts, and educational resources to provide to these restaurants to sort of remove the burden of having to research things on their own. And so we have foodware guidelines that we just posted, like a big document that shows, you know, different alternatives to non-plastic foodware. And recently with COVID, there's been a lot of misinformation spread by the plastic industry on how plastics are safer than reusables, but that's not really based on actual, like, legitimate scientific evidence. There's nothing to indicate that reusables are any less safe than single-use plastics right now. So we've done a lot to try to publish reports and blog posts describing, like, helping our restaurants understand, like, how to open safely during COVID, you know, the current science and literature about reusables and COVID and things like that, to try to, again, alleviate the burden of restaurants having to understand that and go and figure that out on their own, and provide those resources for them. And finally, Surfrider is a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit. So the certification cost, which is between $125 and $175 a year, depending on how many employees a restaurant has, that is a tax-deductible donation for our certification program. And we also have like a monthly OFR newsletter that connects restaurants and sort of highlights different innovations and business practices that can ideally inspire restaurants and help brainstorm and collaborate. Here in Washington, we have 41 registered OFRs. I think at least 4 of those are platinum. I forgot to mention that if a restaurant does all of the optional criteria in addition to the 5 main criteria, they are labeled as a platinum OFR, which is really snazzy. So here in the Northwest Straits, we have 7. Last time I looked, hopefully that is still accurate. And some other chapters have varying amounts of them as well, because we have 5 chapters here in Washington. And I'm just going to have gratuitous food pictures from here on out, pretty much, because why not? So these are the Northwest Straits OFRs. So this is an image I just pulled off of the web map, which I'll go into in a second. But the food co-op is kicking butt and taking names. Apparently Sage Against the Machine, which is my favorite food truck name. is doing really well as well. I'm not as familiar with the other ones. Seize the Day has the freshest oysters in town, so I hear. And so this is the OFR web map. If you go to our national page and you click on it, hopefully it will let me, there we go. So this is Surfrider's page and their web map, and you can actually zoom in on where you are in the world. And here in Bellingham, for example, we have this star indicates that it's a platinum OFR. So we've got a couple of them here. And if you click on it, you can see what kind of food genre it is. So this is fast casual at the Co-op Deli, platinum level. There's a link to the website, the address, and then it also lists which criteria they have used to certify themselves. So that's the co-op, and then if we have Sage Against the Machine, again, it'll tell you it's a food truck, tells you all the ocean-friendly practices. Some of the additional criteria are not really available to them as a food truck because they don't have an actual building. And then you have here Keenan's, which is by the Hilton, fine dining, and here's their additional ocean-friendly practices that they follow. And what's cool about the ocean-friendly restaurant program that I find kind of fascinating is the fact that you can have food trucks and then fine dining at the Hilton, and they're all able to find ways to be ocean-friendly within their very different businesses. And so we have, restaurants at SeaTac, like big hotels, and we have tiny juice bars and food trucks, and they're all doing what they can to be ocean-friendly with the support of their Surfrider membership. And so that to me is like one of the coolest parts of this program. And I'll just touch on the future of OFRs, and then if any of you guys who are OFR Bellingham specific experts, feel free to chime in after I finish talking about this slide about specific restaurants if you want to. But right now, chapters, like the restaurant industry has been hit particularly hard by the pandemic, as you all are aware. And unfortunately, chapters are not able to support their OFRs in the traditional ways that they used to by attending events and hosting meetings and doing launch parties, which is unfortunate given the need for increased support right now. But chapters have done a really good job at adapting and just doing a lot of social media promotion, encouraging people to write reviews. That's a very powerful way that you can help a restaurant, is write a positive review about them. Advertising which restaurants are doing curbside pickup, hours of operation, kind of just getting the information so it's easy for people to know how to go to those restaurants and buy that food. And another cool thing that chapters are doing is offering up gift certificates. So I think here you guys are doing a photo competition, if I'm right. And there's some other chapters doing like cleanup competitions and things with offering gift certificates to OFRs as a reward or as a raffle to help, again, encourage business to support our OFRs during this time. And again, we're providing guidance from headquarters on reusable foodware and how to adapt to the changing conditions of COVID, and providing updated information on what the science says about reusables and plastic-free options during COVID. And we are also acknowledging that, like, right now, restaurants, our OFRs can't necessarily maintain a lot of their OFR ocean-friendly practices right now. Like, some are legally not allowed to allow reusable bags and things like that. And so we're being very cognizant and understanding. If you go to an OFR and they serve you something in like a plastic cup, like, it's probably pandemic related. And so please don't be mean to them. And ultimately, the goal of this program is to make it self-obsolete. We would love to get to a place where every restaurant is inherently ocean friendly. But until then, we want to reward the industry leaders that are, leading the charge and being sustainable and taking that extra step. This is not a silver bullet solution to the plastic problem, but it is an important step down a long road away from plastics. And it does a really effective job of addressing the low-hanging fruit of single-use plastics in the food industry, which we know is one of the prevalent problems that we see in the world today. So with that, I just want to thank you guys and end with an inspirational quote and some links to your local friendly Surfrider chapters page. So I will open the floor to questions if anybody has any.
Awesome.
Clap, but that doesn't really work so great on Zoom. So yay. Thanks so much. I would just add that for the recording, for those links, we'll add them into the description of the YouTube channel so that people can find those links pretty easily. And I would also add that this has been a super beneficial program here locally in Bellingham because while we've been working on our ocean-friendly restaurants program, we've been working with our local businesses, and right before COVID started, we were making some serious headway on a local ordinance to really reduce single-use plastics in our restaurants and food industry. But things are moving a little bit slower, but it's been really a great program to really build the case that, hey, this is doable. Places are already doing it. Look how easy it is. They've already problem solved these issues to help other restaurants get up to that place they need to be more ocean friendly. So that's all I had. Just wanted to.
That's an excellent point. I'll add that to the slide. All right. Well, thank you guys for attending the August chapter meeting.
Thank you so much, Liz.
Thanks so much, Liz.
Yeah.